So the observation I want to start with is that in terms of effectiveness, Easter doesn't work very well at first. I mean, it works out great for Jesus, but I mean for the disciples. Like the words of the women seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. That first proclamation of the Easter Alleluia accomplishes very little. I guess it gives Peter an excuse to get a workout in. He takes a run to the tomb, and he leaves the empty tomb with its folded grave clothes amazed, although it's not quite clear how much of that amazement we should attribute to faith and how much belongs to confusion. Beyond Peter, though, that first Easter proclamation meets with embarrassed smiles from the ranks of Jesus' chosen 12. Small shakes of the head. I think it's too little to just consider the disciples skeptical. St. Augustine, when he writes of this passage, he uses the Latin term that gives us delirium, as though the women had had some sort of mental break. That like tomorrow there would be unicorns, and one of the Marys would claim to be Mary Todd Lincoln. Perhaps the most hopeful among the disciples wished they could believe it, but they just couldn't. It must be nice to go through life with a ready credulity rather than to face the cold, hard facts of reality, you know? Isn't that what unbelievers and doubters still say about the faithful today? I'm here to tell you, it's all true. You can believe it. But even if you were born in the church, you have probably been an Easter morning disciple at one time or another. Heard the story and thought, yeah, right. That'd be nice. Maybe even today, Easter is an idle tale in your life. Get through this service, get onto the Easter eggs or the Easter ham or whatever's in your future. Being an Easter morning disciple, well, at least you're in good company. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, the other James, Simon the Zealot, Judas the good one, because Judas the bad one's already dead. But all the others, all 11 of them, I'm going to suggest sort of imaginatively what a few of these gentlemen thought when the women came back with their tale. Now, I do not know, of course, if Bartholomew or Simon or James thought the thoughts or felt the feels that I'm about to describe to them as individuals. But I do know that the great saints of the church over hundreds of years understood that these reasons were among the reasons the Easter morning disciples did not believe. Maybe you can relate. Simon the Zealot rolled his eyes right up and over his head when the women started speaking. Beneath his graying beard and his broken and cracked teeth, Simon had the simplest objection of them all. It's Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, who made a mean lamb stew, by the way. And the other women, they all had this one thing in common. They were women. Why had they all traveled to the tomb in a pack anyway? Was this like a bathroom break at a prom dinner? And we may call him a sexist pig today, but that would be unfair because pigs aren't kosher. Even making allowances that Simon was a man of his day, he was a particular sort of man. Simon the Zealot got his nickname because he'd spent his youthful years associated with the loosely organized and occasionally violent resistance movement against the Romans known as the Zealots. Simon was a man who slept with a dagger underneath his cloak. He snuck into banquets he wasn't supposed to be at. He bribed officials. He planned assassinations. There was only one true king, God himself. Simon knew that, but Simon's religious fervor was matched by a knowledge of how the world works. And Simon knew that the world worked not on the tails of women, but on the twists of the knives of men. So he shook his head let out a big, distinctly audible sigh, and leaned back. As he caressed the worn handle of his dagger, he thought, the first time man ever listened to a woman, he ended up biting the apple that secured his death. Surely God would not entrust a modern-day Eve with the message that secured his life. Actually, that would be a very godlike thing to do. As St. Augustine would write a couple hundred years later, the woman in paradise announced death to her husband, and the women in the church announced salvation to the men. Simon was like, nah, not even God is that out there. Idle tales these women bring. Now, Bartholomew's problem was a little bit different. He hadn't been sleeping much. His eyes were bloodshot. His body just ached from exhaustion. The trauma of the last few days was surpassed only by the deep, sticky sadness and sorrow that clung to him everywhere he went. The nightmare of the cross, Jesus cries in agony, the blood, the sweat, and the final limpness of the body just hanging there. It wouldn't go away. Like a terminal diagnosis, it was all he could think about, all of the moments of all of the days. Besides, his sister had recently died in childbirth, and his father was bedridden, and Jesus hadn't fixed either of those things either. So maybe this had all been pointless to begin with. I mean, what's the point of a Messiah if he doesn't fix all your problems? And now we had a new problem, which was that the Romans were probably going to come after them, the disciples, now that they'd taken care of Jesus. So as the women were talking, Bartholomew was just appending items to his lists of problems and woes. He was traumatized and sorrow-filled and afraid. Joanna was just then sharing how the two men who miraculously appeared had told them to remember what Jesus had said, that he must be handed over, that he would be crucified, and that he would rise again. But give a man enough problems, he'll forget the promises. Many years after this first Easter, human beings would invent text messages. And this phenomenon of problems replacing promises would become manifest on our screens digitally. Like if you've been married in, let's say, the last decade or so, you can probably scroll up from the text message fight you are having with your spouse, and you can find the flirtatious texts you sent each other after that amazing second date. But how present problems can overwhelm past promises. Bartholomew sat at the table just staring at his folding hands, thinking, maybe I should scroll back up through my list of interactions with Jesus to those promises. Maybe he really had promised all this was coming. But the problems feel a lot more real. These idle tales on the women's lips don't change much. And what about the other James? This is the James whose mother does not make the mean lamb stew. This is the James whose brother is not John. This is James, the son of Alphaeus. His dad, Alphaeus, shared a profession with his own brother, Joseph, the legal father of Jesus. Yes, according to tradition, Joseph and Alphaeus were brothers, making James and Jesus cousins. Like Joseph, Alphaeus had been a builder. We use carpenter all the time, but their job was more like part craftsman, part engineer, like first century handyman. And of all the traits that James had inherited from his father Alphaeus, the strongest was his demand to know how things work. I tend to sympathize with James. As a child, one of my favorite books was How Things Work, which was full of diagrams and explanations that fulfilled the promise on the cover. Yes, I was a really cool kid. Also, the most amazing miracles we work as human beings, like that our phones talk to satellites, that our drugs kill germs, that our bridges span seas, that our cathedrals pierce the sky, all these miracles turn on the question of us overcoming the how, doing the thing that seems impossible. That's how we make marvels. Unfortunately, in God's great Wordle game, these three letters are all yellow. You have to rearrange them. Right? For God, the question is not how, but it is who. And that's because for God, I'm going to drop it every service. For God, the problem is never how. God is never constrained by the impossibility of answering how. So that's not where God's greatest marvels are. God's greatest marvels are the whos that he has created. Who are you? Who is Jesus? It's always the questions God is interested in. Even when God gives his own name, God says, I am who I am. Yet the Jameses and the Andrews, and perhaps the yous of the world, keep getting hung up on how things work. And it doesn't seem like a resurrection should work. Like, it doesn't seem possible. Even if there were angels, even if the tomb were empty, how would a resurrection work? Like, what did it look like inside the tomb? James got up. He paced back and forth across the room because this was a familiar feeling. This, like, how the heck did that happen is actually a thing he thought quite a lot. Ever since Jesus did the thing with the wine at the wedding of Cana, this kept happening. And slowly it had given way. This befuddlement had given way to like a pervasive faith that maybe Jesus really is the Messiah. No, like this is too much. This is too far. There has to be a limit to what is reasonable, surely. As Theophylact of Orod would write later, the resurrection is naturally incredible, an idle tale. So such were the Easter morning disciples, a mixed lot, with mixed reasons for their unbelief, untrusting of the message bearers, mired in their own pain and sorrow, and simply faced with something that defied all human experience. Easter was not the disciples suffering some mass delusion. On the contrary, on Easter, they couldn't even agree on why it was absurd. It's better for us, really, that the disciples didn't believe. Because their overcoming of those doubts, the same sort of doubts we still have today, should strengthen our faith. These men were not easily fooled. They did not initially believe. And what happens next is that Jesus showed up to these disciples, time and again on the road to Emmaus, in the upper room, on the shore of the sea, on the mountain. And the Simons of the world learned that the women had been right. And not only was that a dramatic act of God's grace, that Eve's fateful words were undone by a band of women, it has repeatedly been true that those that society calls less than have been more articulate of the gospel truth than the movers and shakers. It's still true today. If you want to feel the Easter gospel, come serve with people who aren't trying to run the world. Set down the daggers, whether yours are made of steel or keyboard. Easter is in the hands of the lowly. The Bartholomews learn, reluctantly, that Jesus' promises aren't about the absence of suffering, but about the consistency of God's love. The cross, with its suffering that leads to the resurrection, is the archetype of that. Faith doesn't make life easy. All of these disciples would be murdered as martyrs, actually. But the good news of this Easter morning is more than enough to meet any challenge, any pain, any fear, any sorrow. Christ beats death and any fear or sorrow that would take us there. And in fact, just as the cross becomes the banner of our salvation, the sorrows and pains of life can become the championship banners that hang in the rafters of our lives. The banners that hang in your hearts, in the souls of the people in this room, mark the victories of the Lord over the forces of darkness. And what about the other James? I don't know. How did it work? I don't know. There's no behind-the-scenes documentary. There's no chapter in the How Things Work book on resurrections. But James found that Jesus kept showing up. Instead of how, he got the who, the person of Jesus, the relationship with God. And the best proof of Easter is that the power of Jesus in the world keeps working in us and through us. There really is no reason you cannot believe that one of the Easter morning disciples did not already try. Each of those Easter morning disciples blazed a path of doubt that led to faith. They've been there. They've done that. And Jesus showed up. So here's to the Easter morning disciples, doubters of idle tales. And here's to their resurrected Lord who believed in them anyway and turned their doubts into the rock of our faith. Jesus kept showing up, and he keeps showing up in our lives and one day in our deaths. And as we move from doubt to faith, that final period in our life turns into an ellipsis. Alleluia. Amen.